So Dale is the National Climate Change Program Manager for Environmental Defence Canada. He has over 20 years of experience working in environmental protection, the vast majority on climate change and energy issues. Most of his work has been in policy advocacy and campaigning with environmental defence. Dale works to move Canada towards greater action and responsibility on climate change and a phase out of fossil fuels such as oil, coal, and natural gas. Dale also developed VSO International's climate change strategy with a focus on adaptation and spent 2 years in Cambodia building the capacity of local NGOs to integrate climate change impacts and adaptation into their programs. Dale has a master's in resource and environmental management from Simon Fraser University, a BSc in environmental science and biology from the University of Western Ontario, and a mechanical engineering degree from McGill University. Please join me in welcoming Dale Marshall.
Thanks a lot, Graham. Okay, good. Good morning. Again, my name is Dale Marshall. I'm with Environmental Defence. I'm honored and really excited to be here to talk to you about nature-based climate solutions with such a large... Okay. Thank you. Is that better? Yeah. All right. Here we go, round two. So yeah, Dale Marshall with Environmental Defence. I'm honored and excited to be in a large room of people who are all interested in nature-based climate solutions. Today I will not actually be talking a lot about nature-based climate solutions. What I've been asked to do, oh, that's a pointer. So how do I switch the slides? There we go, thank you. So what I've been asked to do is mostly lay out the big challenge that we have in front of us in terms of dealing with climate change, the impacts, but also how we reduce emissions to ensure that we don't reach truly catastrophic levels of climate change. I will touch a bit, of course, on the solutions, including the role that nature-based climate solutions can play. Next slide. So starting with the impacts that we've been seeing. You can scroll through these as I'm talking. 2019 felt like a year where we saw an increased and even accelerated impacts of climate change. These are pictures from Ottawa River flooding, the Gatineau River flooding. 2 out of the last 3 years we've seen historic flooding. We've seen that in other parts of Canada as well. Next slide. 2019 felt like the year of fires. It felt like everywhere was on fire, from the California wildfires. The Amazon had tens of thousands of fires. There were fires in the Arctic, and of course the devastating fires that happened in Australia and the huge impacts it had there on biodiversity. Next. And of course, for Canada, we are particularly vulnerable because we're a northern nation. We're warming twice as fast overall, and in the Arctic, that means 3 times as fast. And so as the permafrost thaws, we're going to be we're seeing it already, impacts on human infrastructure, but even more importantly, impacts on critical ecosystems that are found in the north. This one. 2019 was also the year of climate mobilization. I mean, we had 1 million people in the streets of Canada, joining millions from around the world, calling for much greater action from our leaders on climate change. And so with that being, the impacts coming, all of the mobilization, there was really an incredible disconnect between that and what we saw in terms of actual countries stepping forward to take greater action. We saw there was most notable at the COP at the end of the year in Madrid, where we really had countries that were reluctant to even talk about enhancing their ambition as part of the Paris Agreement. Next. But there are solutions, and they're out there. the importance, I do want to highlight the importance between warming to 1.5 degrees or warming to 2 degrees, and many of you will know this, but the reason that 1.5 has now become the threshold is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's research just really shows the incredible level of impacts that occur as the planet warms from 1.5 to 2. We're talking hundreds of millions of people on Earth additionally impacted when you move to those moved up to 2 degrees. People having food and water insecurity, many more people displaced. And then, of course, incredible impacts on biodiversity. Huge toll in terms of increased impacts on species, increased risk of extinction, and even entire ecosystems like coral disappearing, and incredible biodiversity and importance to those ecosystems disappearing at the same time. Thanks. So the challenge, though, of course, is in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, global greenhouse gas emissions have to go down by 7.6% per year, every year between now and 2030. That's globally, at a time when global emissions are possibly stable, possibly going down, but possibly just stabilizing. So it is an incredible challenge. And for Canada, next one, please. The challenge is even greater. And this was a graphic that was developed by Climate Action Network and its members to highlight how Canada has, and other industrialized countries, have an outsized responsibility of dealing with this issue. Here's where my pointer comes in handy. Oh, go back, please. Let's see if I can do that. Maybe not. I can't reach it. Can we go back to the slide, though, with the graphic, please? There we go. So I'll just describe it. The first dot that you see down from there, that's Canada's target, 30% reduction by 2030. The next one down, this represents Canada's fair share. Because we and other industrialized countries are the ones that are responsible for the problem, because we have benefited so much economically and have such wealth based on the fact that we've used the atmosphere as a free dumping ground for 2 centuries. We now have an outsized responsibility. And our fair share under a 1.5 scenario is 140% decrease in emissions by 2030. Yes, I know we can't reduce emissions more than 100%. So this is a representation of what Canada's fair share would be. At least a 60% reduction domestically, and then investment, climate financing to help other countries to reduce their emissions to get to that total. So that is the challenge before us. If Canada wants to do its fair share to limit warming from the 1.5 degrees, which is already going to be fairly devastating, to the 2 degrees. Next one, please. Now we're at the solutions part. We know what the solutions are. We are starting to put them in place in Canada, and that's heartwarming. Can you put the next one, please? But we do need an all-of-the-above approach. And often all of the above talks about energy sources, so we have to access all of the energy sources. But in this case, what I'm talking about is all of the policy approaches, all of the technological approaches. We need to address greenhouse gases that come from our energy systems. We need to address greenhouse gases that are emanating from our ecosystems. We need to preserve carbon stores. We know what the policies are that work. They have been put into place in many parts of the world, and we have technologies to harness the action that we need. Next one, please. This is a picture of the Canadian Prime Minister and all premiers from provinces and territories 3 years ago, finalizing the PanCanadian Framework on Climate Change. Next one. And it is a historic document. And in many cases, what I look at as a test is in the different sectors that are being addressed, is to ask, is this a plan to decarbonize, to get rid of fossil fuels in these sectors. Fossil fuels are the source of climate change. In order to address climate change, we need to be phasing them out. In a lot of cases, the PCF, the PanCanadian Framework, does do that. Next one. So we have a coal phase out by 2030. This is obviously critical given that coal is one of the dirtiest forms of energy, and there are alternatives. I put up not a coal plant, but a solar worker, because that's hopefully where we move towards. It's directly from coal to renewables. It was less than a decade ago that we were still building large coal units in Canada. And in the next 10 years, we'll be getting rid of them. And in Alberta, we may be getting rid of them in the next 5. Like, it is a monumental change, and it shows what is possible when you put your mind to doing something, when we do. Zero emission strategy for vehicles. Again, this is about moving towards away from oil, which is a fossil fuel, towards electricity, which is hopefully as much as possible. Right now, we need to increase that quite a bit of our renewable source. So if it is emissions-free, renewable source of electricity, we can get rid of fossil fuels in our transportation sector. Next one. And it's the same with buildings. Net zero energy building code means much greater efficiency in terms of how we build it, but also generating its own energy in terms of renewable energy and getting off of natural gas. So again, phasing out the fossil fuels that are contributing to the emissions from these sectors. So what about Canada's oil and gas? That has been the blind spot for many years in Canada. The oil and gas sector is the largest source of emissions. It's the fastest growing source of emissions. And no government in Canada of any stripe has been willing to say no more. The oil and gas sector is big enough, and now we need to reduce it. Not the Liberals in Ottawa, not the Conservatives in Alberta, not the NDP in BC. If anything, more money, government money, is being put towards these projects as opposed to curtailing them. Next one. So nature-based climate solutions clearly play an important role in this, given the magnitude of the challenge. Next one. This was a graphic that was developed by the IUCN showing ecosystems represent 25% of the problem. That's the source of emissions that come from ecosystems as they're degraded. But they also constitute 30% of the solutions. Research is showing increasingly that we can sequester a lot more carbon in our ecosystems and preserve those carbon stores. But so far, it has not been a big part of the conversation. And I think that is starting to change. I think that's, again, as Graham has said, there are lots of organizations and people that have been working on this for a long time. I feel like there's a sea change that happened over the course of last year. And in Canada, I think that's largely because of the leadership of the people in this room. So nature-based climate solutions can obviously have a big impact on mitigation, reducing emissions to the atmosphere and sequestering more carbon through the preservation of those important carbon stores, through rehabilitating degraded ecosystems, restoring degraded ecosystems, and better managing our land, including moving more towards Indigenous-led land management and parks management. Nature-based climate solutions can also play a role in terms of adaptation and resilience. And we know that all of these things are also connected. Healthy ecosystems hold more carbon. Places that have a lot of carbon often overlap with places that are rich in biodiversity. And resilient ecosystems, of course, allow for the better adaptation of human systems and human adaptation to some of those climate change impact, whether it's fires or droughts, storms, etc. But Canada's ecosystems are at higher risk because of the additional warming. Next one. Oh, next one, please. So, I mean, I hope what you're going to take away from this is the challenge is huge. I put up that graphic again because it is a almost incomprehensible challenge that we face, and we can't have a policy in one area be cannibalizing another. You have provinces that sometimes say, you know, our regulations on methane, our regulations on cars won't be as strong, but it's okay, we'll make up for it over here because we'll put into place this other policy. We need all of the above. To get the kinds of emission reductions to avoid catastrophic climate change, we need to be using them all. And that's the same for nature-based climate solutions and addressing our greenhouse gases that come from our energy systems. We can't be saying that we will continue to increase emissions from our oil and gas sector or from international aviation and simply say it's okay because we're going to buy offsets over here. We need it all in terms of emission reductions. And the reality is that the economics are there, the technologies make sense, and it's just a matter of doing it. So thank you very much.